Welcome to my channel, HFY Epic Narratives. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Jax Harrow was very good at three things: coaxing grudging life out of broken engines, finding things nobody else remembered losing, and telling terrible jokes at inopportune moments. The scorched wind did not care for his jokes. The twin sons of the Arendor cluster did not care either. They hung low and yellow in the brittle sky like impatient overseers warming themselves over a funeral pyre. The wreckage field was a cathedral of twisted metal and melted glass and the bones of ships that had finally given up to the heat. Somewhere under that cathedral, in a corner marked by an old corporate insignia and a smear of iridescent smoke, hung a dangling wire that blinked like a polite nervous thing. Jax poked it with a plasma wrench, because that was what a man with grease on his nails and a universe of unpaid bills does when confronted with a blinking wire: poke it. The wrench had been modified over the years, a handle wrapped in a strip of salvaged fabric, a secondary grip for leverage, an emergency grappling hook tucked inside the head. It was more of a companion than a tool, and it had a habit of making a soft, sarcastic whine when he used it. He liked that. It understood. The wire sparked. The spark wafted upward like a small, guilty comet, and then everything in a 3-meter radius started doing the one thing wreckage did best: it decided to surprise him. Panels unlatched themselves with long-suffering sighs, an access hatch spat a cloud of warm sand and iridescent smoke that smelled faintly of burnt tea, and at the center of it all, cradled in a nest of torn bioshell and shattered glass, something opened its eyes. They were not the kind of eyes humans had. They were too wide, too reflective, and they held a depth of color that made the iridescent smoke around them look almost shy. They blinked in a sequence that looked suspiciously like amusement and then, with a voice like wind through a chime, said, "Oh, you have very messy gloves." Jax nearly fell backward off the hull he was standing on. He was supposed to be a mechanic, not a dramatist. He recovered with the panache of someone who recovered from falling because he was used to falling, from ships, from bad deals, from expectations. "Only the ones on days that require dramatic entrances," he said. He had meant that to be funny. The alien blinked at him, and even under scorched skin and tangled wires she looked like a professional at being unimpressed. "That is not a day," she corrected in a voice that managed to be both musical and entirely unsympathetic. "It is encouraging me to live." She called herself Aelara when he pried the biosuit access free with a practice tug, and the suit, slicked in silvery skin and jagged scratches, made a soft, purring whine. The biosuit was still attempting self-repair, a nervous, flickering, polite thing that patched with a slow, glow-in-the-dark stitch that favored aesthetics over speed. Aelara's eyelids made her iridescent eyes look like molten metal folding in on themselves. She was a princess, which Jax learned the hard way when a tiny hollow badge in the suit blinked with the crest of the alumni and a courteous chorus of ancestral names cascaded through an internal speaker. The suit coughed a faint apology. "Princess of..." Jax tried. He had a good memory for insignias and a bad memory for politeness protocols. The alumni name was long and edged with vowels that made him feel like he should have bowed. He didn't. He had a stubborn dislike of formal postures when his knees were still a little sand-coated and his lunch had been a can of something labeled proteinish. "Aelara," she said simply. "Princess Aelara of the alumni. And you, human, are the thing that prodded my biosuit back into a mild state of functionality." "That would be my Sunday best," Jax said, because people introduced themselves with snappy lines in the places he had been hired, and because it helped him stay less scared. "Name's Jax Harrow. Mechanic, scavenger, part-time philosopher. I fix things, sometimes I don't, and I make a mean cup of reconstituted coffee." The biosuit hummed like a cat considering his life choices. Aelara allowed a sliver of a smile, a movement so small it could have been an in-joke. It softened her alien angles into something almost human. "You are messy and invasive," she observed. "Also, unexpectedly persistent. The alumni protocol for survival between wreckage is to remain still and await retrieval." "Thought I'd try a more proactive approach," Jax said. He meant it as a joke. The princess did not laugh. She did, however, cough a sputter of sand, and one of her fingers, long, delicate, tipped with a reflective keratin that caught the twin suns and threw them back like stung glass, brushed the edge of his plasma wrench. That touch was small but decisive. The biosuit registered a biometric imprint and, with the sort of bureaucratic crackle that made Jax's chest tighten, accepted that another had interceded in Aelara's preservation. Somewhere in the ancient code of the alumni, in the ceremonial memory chips that told their armies what to do in the presence of certain emergencies, a flag had been tripped. Saving a royal, whether accidentally or on purpose, was not a private act. It was a claim, a historical binding that trickled outward like spilled tea. "Do not touch my calms," Aelara said tersely, but the calms were already beating out a faint, crystalline signal that looked like a tiny aurora in the air and hummed a note like a far-off bell. Jax, who had fixed calms and fried calms, knew that sound. It was a call and a name and, he would soon learn, an invitation with more conditions than a 10-year warranty. A week later, while Jax and Aelara were still arguing over whether a scrap of alumni etiquette required him to carry her across a half-buried walkway, it didn't, but the biosuit beeping at his shoulder like a nervous insect convinced him. A formation of exosuited guards thundered across the dunes toward them. They were graceful, in the way that a predator might be graceful, and terrifying in the way that armored people always are: silhouette, visor, intent. The leading suit carried a standard that shimmered with the same crest the biosuit had flashed, Aelara's crest. Behind it, the sand coughed and the horizon bloomed into smaller forms, landing skiffs, banners snapping like metal, a ragged parade that might have once been ceremonial and now looked like a mechanized curiosity. Jax did what he always did, he tried to hide. He stood behind a chunk of wreckage that looked largely inert and unlikely to shift for the next several centuries, though he suspected otherwise. It worked about as well as hiding had ever worked for him. He saw the guards, the banners, the disciplined formation, and felt every part of his body tense into a shrug. The leading commander strode up with the kind of posture you only saw on television or in places that had never been sandblasted by plasma storms. "Princess Aelara," he intoned. He said it without inflection, the way you announce a weather event. "By alumni code and heritage, your chosen protector must present themselves for recognition." Aelara blinked. "Protector," she repeated. The biosuit gave her a readout in a language that clicked and sang. Her fingers found the imprint she'd left on the plasma wrench, the human thumbprinting embedded in the alloy like an accidental promise. "He saved me by medical interference and physical intervention. He poked a wire," Jax offered, because that was how his heroism had happened and because he liked to file claims honestly. "Also, I fixed a coolant line." There was a long pause. The commander looked at Jax's plasma wrench with something between suspicion and interest. "Protector designation requires a recital of trials," he said. "Trials may include, but are not limited to, demonstration of strength, demonstration of cleverness, demonstration of loyalty. Also, at times of cultural emergency, the protector is allowed, per the Treaty of Hollow Dunes, to make an offering." "Offering?" Jax said slowly. He glanced at the wrench, which hummed affirmatively. It liked being noticed. "I have a tool. And a debt to a vending machine." Aelara's laugh was soft and startled, a thing that made the guards' helmets seem suddenly very hot and heavy. "This human," she said to no one in particular, and you could hear pity in the way she said it. Not cruel pity. Curious pity. "Is therefore recognized. The alumni accept unusual echoes of heroism." That was how the army began to follow him, not because he wanted command, or even because he believed himself particularly capable. He was, at best, competent in the specific field of fixing things, but because in their cultural matrix, saving a princess was an act that converted fate into obligation. The alumni had historical protocols that unfolded like a map when the right flags were triggered. They were tidy about it, impossibly ceremonious about it, and infinitely, comically literal. They also presumed, without irony, that as her chosen protector, Jax would now lead them back to the alumni capital for formal recognition, or, in less official terms, provide them with an itinerary. It is a truth of the galaxy that rules multiply when someone awkward steps into an honored role. Jax's awkwardness multiplied, as did the guard contingent. Leadership was not natural to Jax. He had no appetite for banners, no interest in uniforms, and a temperament that preferred mechanical sympathy over political persuasion. But the alumni, thorough to a fault, had a system called ceremonial escort and another called protective incorporate. The escort, given his unwilling participation, came with logistics, tents that filtered sand, crates of stale protein ration bars that the alumni politely labeled as fortitude wafers, and a quorum of counselors who insisted he try on a ceremonial coat. He declined the coat. He accepted, with a good-natured grimace, a cup of something the alumni assured him was comfort broth. It tasted like home if home were a place with more salt and less common sense. What Jax did accept willingly was the company of an AI orb named Quibble, because of course there was an AI orb named Quibble in a story like this. Quibble had been part of the station's maintenance team, a cheerful, malfunctioning sphere that emitted helpful tips and terrible jokes in equal measure. It had been salvaged by the alumni and enthusiastically assigned to serve as liaison to the human element, a description Quibble took literally. When Quibble hovered up to Jax and introduced itself in a chirpy voice like a radio station that had been trained in puns, Jax felt better immediately. "Pleased to be in your orbit," Quibble chirped. "Also, please resist pressing external hazard control." "Why wouldn't I?" Jax said, amused because it felt good to be amused. "What are the odds of me walking into an embedded detonator?" Quibble made a small honking noise. "Probability, 37% if you are wearing the ceremonial coat. Also, your wrench is pretty." The soundtrack of the following days was sand scraping, the whistle of distant plasma storms, and the careful clack of boots on remade metal. The alumni formed a rear guard behind Jax wherever he went because that was how a protector moved in their culture. The protector led, the army observed, and the universe pretended that it was all very formal. Aelara walked beside him when she could, her biosuit's repairs making gentle, embarrassed noises as it fussed with itself. She watched him with a mixture of amusement and analysis, and in those quiet moments she spoke like someone unfolding a map. "Why do humans make jokes when terrified?" she asked once, as the twin suns threw long shadows that made the sand look like a river of gold. Jax had a taste for the absurd. "Because it's cheaper than crying," he said. "Also, makes the monsters less smug." Aelara considered this. "It makes you smaller," she observed. "In a way I find pleasing. It is the particular cruelty of cosmic irony that often the very thing which saves you is the one you never meant to use as a saving grace." For Jax, humor had operated as a shield long enough to be assumed armor. He had used it to keep bad deals from becoming worse, to make strangers less dangerous, to keep his own nervous system from cataloging every scar. It would, inadvertently, galvanize a small army. The first real test came not from political intrigue but from desperate greed. The Arendor cluster, for all its twin suns and beguiling light, was a good place to be the target of someone with a spindle of profit and a grenade launcher. A salvage company called Morrow's Guild, corporate mercenaries in polished exosuits with logos and an attitude, had been hanging around the cluster like a wasp. They claimed ancestral rights to certain wrecks and had a long history of acquiring other people's property. They'd shown up on the alumni sensors with shields up and a smile ready for auction. They wanted Aelara's biosuit for its tech, and they wanted the prestige of capturing a royal. They didn't care about consent. Jax expected them to negotiate. He expected them to send emissaries with two bright smiles. He did not expect them to activate a scorched metal protocol that resembled a bug zapper and then attempt to corral Aelara and her parade into a transport. He did expect his plasma wrench to hum like a kettle about to whistle. The first shot was a mistake, fired by an overeager marksman who had been told to intimidate. The bolt scattered plastically across a hull and, according to the laws of large things in small places, bounced back and struck an exposed conduit. The hull shuddered. For a moment, the world held its breath because the Arendor cluster had taught every species present that holding breath in a place of plasma storms was idiomatic, not literal. Then everything erupted into motion. Jax's reaction was instinctual. He had fixed engines that were dying, and he understood the anatomy of ferocious metal better than he did the anatomy of commanders. He grabbed the plasma wrench like a baton and ran. He did not run to impress anyone or to claim any narrative other than survival. He ran because he had learned that moving fast sometimes cleared a path of destiny's footfalls. He swung the wrench like he'd never wielded anything before. It was not graceful. It was pure, loud, and effective. He clawed a Morrow Guild soldier on the ankle, and that was the sort of unexpected thing that precipitated poor planning on the part of the soldiers. He smacked a panel with enough force to throw the soldier off balance. He bumped a control console so hard the console coughed a useless error and the transport's hinge jammed. In the heat and fury, humor slipped out of him like a reflex. "If you wanted a handout, you could have just asked nicely," he yelled. The words had the ring of someone telling off a vending machine. The guards around Aelara moved with choreography and purpose. They fanned out and formed a human or lumnite shield with a grace that could only be achieved through centuries of training and a cultural obsession with protocol. The Morrow Guild, hunched in their corporate gleam, did not anticipate that their efforts would be undone by an improvisational human and an army that took every metaphor as literal directive. Quibble sang overhead, a tiny, ridiculous warble that included the statistic, probability of survival increased by 32% when one was wearing a grin. Aelara, caught in the middle of the melee, did something Jax did not expect. She laughed. Not a soft, polite sound, but a bright, incredulous burst. It was the sound of someone who had been a hostage of expectations and now found the script flipped in ways that amused her thoroughly. "You are awful," she said, with the affectionate scorn of someone who appreciates an exceptionally bad joke. Her biosuit, in turn, did the only thing a flickering piece of high-tech chivalry could. It deployed a thin, iridescent barrier that shimmered like an oil slick and deflected a stun bolt. The soldiers from Morrow Guild blinked at that, and then their captain made a decision that bore the hubris of people sure they were owed a screen time. They called for air support. That was when the sky tore open in a way the Arendor cluster regarded as impolite. The horizon rippled and a beast of metal dropped out of it like something that had been forgotten and then remembered with interest. Dropships, polished to a gleam and hungry for credit, descended. They opened their bellies and disgorged automatons and drone swarms that hummed with corporate efficiency. Jax looked at the sky, the drones, the armored infantry, and then at Aelara, and decided on a plan he had never rehearsed. It did not involve commanding an army, though it quickly became the sort of plan that required immediate oversight. Jax taught the alumni one improvised technique that afternoon, the tactical wrench swing. It had the elegance of a blunt instrument used skillfully and the grace of a man who never intended to lead but found his feet doing it anyway. He swung, they cheered, he dodged, they adjusted their formation, he made a ridiculous face when a stubby drone first tried to take a logical approach and it failed, spectacularly. There was silence at the end when the last drone's propeller decided the sand would make an excellent cushion. Quibble, in the way of over-enthusiastic support units, recited casualty figures that included a round number 4 number of robots who will always be unexpectedly soggy. The alumni, who had watched humanity with half a cartoonish bias and half curious admiration, clapped. They clapped with armored hands, with banners that had been up to then ceremonial, and with an affection that settled like dust. From that moment, the ship of events, clumsy and overly scraped, set sail on an unexpectedly favorable wind. News traveled through the Arendor cluster at the speed of gossip and the stubbornness of a rumor. The Morrow Guild recalibrated with the grace of a corporation with legal teams, but public relations in places with twin suns mattered, and they were losing. The alumni's internal systems, having recognized the Protector's weird efficacy, began to interpret Jax's jests as a form of morale-boosting ritual. Aelara began to touch the plasma wrench when she thought no one was looking, as if to check its provenance. For Jax, leadership was a collection of annoyances stitched together by necessity. He had to know the difference between formal recognition and public trial and had to learn how to say no to a solemn ritual involving a bowl of sand. He was unexpectedly competent at negotiations because every corporate negotiator he met underestimated the value of a sharp retort and a good laugh. pirates, smug salvagers, and even a militaristic scavenger clan he cross-examined in a mostly successful bar brawl came to respect the sort of person who could swing a plasma wrench and turn an impending legal injunction into a pun. Accidental heroism has a way of making myths out of the mundane. Jax's name, which had once been associated with mediocre breakfasts and well-loved tools, began to be spoken with a reverence that made him uncomfortable. Children in the alumni camps, who had never seen Earth, painted stars and a figure with a wrench that looked like a god who fixed leaks. Aelara, who had once worn her lineage as an armor of duty, began to look at him like someone who had chosen an odd adventure and then refused to be frightened of its consequences. Which was, of course, exactly the problem. Because the galaxy lacks symmetry and is perverse in its desire for narratives that complicate every bright thing, a new problem arrived that looked like the past and smelled like trouble. The Zentaur Expanse had been ribbing the edges of the Arendor cluster for a long time. It was an area of weakened space, wormholes that dreamed of being useful, and anomalies that taught you geometry was optional. The alumni had avoided it. So had the Morrow Guild, generally. Then a wormhole winked open, not shyly but with the flair of someone who intends to make an entrance. Out of its throat poured a ragged fleet of exosuited mercenaries riding tethered leviathans and salvaged recycler ships that had teeth. They called themselves the Black Mandible Collective for reasons that were probably marketing-driven and ethically ambiguous. They wanted Aelara's biosuit because it hummed like a rare instrument. More desperately, they wanted the social currency of capturing a princess and her protector, an act that would get them funding, freebies, and a plaque in the halls of unfortunate imperial decisions. What they did not expect was a human who had, in the space of a month, become the most infuriatingly effective thing in the sector. Jax, who had an instinctive disdain for anyone who frost-polished their aggression and labeled it enterprise, made a plan that looked like he had drawn it on a napkin because he had. The plan included the following elements: a false retreat, an abandoned station corridor, the unique acoustics of a derelict docking bay, and an elaborate reliance on unorthodox morale. The derelict docking station was an old thing that memories liked to haunt. It was scratched with histories, muffled in iridescent smoke, and had corridors that curved in ways designed by engineers with a tragic sense of humor. Its lighting was half-burned and begged for dramatic effect. It smelled like the inside of a dead animal and the sweetness of old rust. It was perfect for ambushes or reflective introspection. Jax preferred the ambush bit. He organized a retreat that would lure the Black Mandible Collective into the station's entrails. Aelara protested the deception with the charming, furious dignity of someone with royal blood and a penchant for honesty, but she went along because the biosuit self-repair modules whispered that survival sometimes needed artifice. The alumni prepared, as they always were prepared, with meticulous ceremony. Quibble rehearsed tactical advice in a ridiculous cantata. The corridor was long and narrow, with lights that flickered like a heartbeat. The collective marched in, confident in their numbers and their tethered beasts. They had the gravity of certainty. Jax waited until the last possible second and then did the thing that had mysteriously, absurdly, been working for him. He made a terrible joke and then acted on it. On 3, Quibble said in its cheery voice. 1, 2, 3. Jax screamed and slammed his plasma wrench into a wall panel. It rang like a bell. It sounded, for reasons he couldn't explain, absolutely heroic. The sound echoed. Lights popped. A panel fell and released a cloud of iridescent smoke that billowed with the station's old filtration system, and the corridor turned into a stage. The collective's response got theatrical rather than tactical. Their leader, a man with far too much necklace and too little caution, strode forward. Jax, with the agility of someone more practiced at jerry-rigging than at grand poses, dove. It was less graceful than it sounded, but it worked. The plasma wrench cracked against a suit hillock and, with comic timing, dislodged a maintenance pipe that showered a pair of pursuing exolimbs with hot foam. "Is that your strategy?" one of the collective sneered, voice thick with bravado. "Distract them with mechanical comedy?" Jax, who had been sprayed with too much foam to remain regal, grinned. "Distract them, then slam a wrench into their logistics." He shoved his shoulder into a support beam with such force that the corridor shivered and a cascade of small maintenance drones tumbled into the collective's boots like so many offended gnats. The moment the corridor turned into a place of chaos and wit, the alumni did what they did best: they adapted ritual into improvisation. They threw their banners at the opponent's feet in a symbolic gesture that also functioned as a tangling net. They sang an ancestral cadence that, combined with Quibble's cacophony of malfunctioning conundrums, created sound patterns that made the collective's calm stutter. Aelara, meanwhile, moved with elegance through the smoke, biosuit fusing, unfusing, singing like metal and silk. She took the captain alive, politely, with a motion that suggested she regretted the necessity and enjoyed the outcome in equal measure. Victory arrived with an odd, understated bang. The collective's leader, his exosuit smoking and his dignity absent, capitulated. He couldn't quite process that he'd been bested by a human who made jokes and an army that reacted to the shape of the unexpected. It was like losing to a particularly clever vending machine. Jax's methods were not noble in the way people imagine noble things. They were pragmatic, often ridiculous, and sometimes infuriating. He taught the alumni how to turn a ceremony into a tactical advantage. He taught them to build traps out of old etiquette, and he made humor into a directive that increased efficiency. It worked. It worked because humor made people loosen up, and in looseness there was room for creativity. It worked because sometimes the stiff spine of a tradition needed an elbow. The story of the derelict corridor spread. The Mandible Collective retreated, their pride pruned like a hedge. The Morrow Guild filed a fraudulent report and then retreated to their lawyers. The alumni, for reasons that fused gratitude with a touch of delighted astonishment, declared that Jax Harrow had earned a ceremonial title, Harbinger of the Wrench. He accepted it because refusing a title required more energy than he had and because the title sounded amusing in tavern songs. With every victory, the compulsion to follow Jax strengthened. Not all of that compulsion was political. Many in the alumni admired the human's flippant courage. Many were simply relieved to have something unpredictable and, inconveniently, effective at their side. Aelara shared quiet moments with him that were not ceremonies but small, human things, watching a tiny desert flower push through metal and being the only two to laugh at the same accidental metaphor. In those moments, she told him, in a low voice, about the alumni concept of echo homes, places where one's actions left a memory footprint in the world. "You have made an echo," she said. "It will follow." The army following him was not so much an army as an idea that had acquired limbs. They carried their weight with both ceremony and curiosity. They were not unquestioning, they asked him questions because their culture required a kind of mutual interrogation. What was honor? Why did humans swear by gravity noodle recipes? Did a plasma wrench gain a soul if you used it to save a princess? Jax had answers for the last two. The noodle was a tail and the wrench hummed with the things you put into it. The deeper trouble, the kind that travels like a thinking storm, did not come from outside enemies so much as from the universe's tendency to raise the stakes when it felt entertained. There were whispers in the Zentaur Expanse of a warlord named Syrn, who had a fleet that was equal parts cunning and grim. Syrn's ships were built from scavenged dreams and bore the mark of someone who collected trophies like people collected postcards. He had been watching the Arendor cluster with a careful, cruel interest. He liked people who produced stories and trophies alike. He liked trophies more. Syrn's tactics were not simple. He set traps that folded like origami in zero gravity and sent saboteurs who were fast, quiet, and excellent at speechifying. He infiltrated supply lines and tried, with the blunt arrogance of those who believed in destiny like a currency, to buy Aelara's loyalty. He offered gold. He offered forced alliances. He offered a place on a wall. Jax, who believed that one could not be bought but could be sold by mistake, told Syrn where he could shove his offer. It was, to be honest, the first thing in the warlord's day that had the moral clarity of an honest insult. Syrn's response was elegant and terrible. He proposed a duel of reputation. Not a duel with blades, that would be archaic, but a contest that would satisfy the narrative appetites of various galactic courts. He threatened to parlay Aelara's capture into a ceremonial claim that would make him look both powerful and philosophical. It was a political move wrapped in the aesthetics of challenge. He planned to take a band of captors and stage a spectacle of dominance. He thought theatrically. He did not, crucially, account for the human propensity to improvise. The battle that followed was less about explosives and more about absurd logistics. Syrn's fleet did, indeed, lay a trap, a false convoy, a glittering prize intended to lure Jax into the open. Jax's response was to treat it like a stage set and to improvise as if he were in a farce. He dressed in a ridiculous coat he found accidentally actual ceremonial coat for alumni town crier and accepted the bait with the dignity of someone about to sign a bad autograph. He sailed with the alumni on a skiff that chopped through sand like a boat through milk. The twin suns framed the scene half mythically and half sandblasted. Quibble recited poetry in a tone of voice that tried to be solemn and failed gloriously. Aelara stood beside him, biosuit neutral and a little fascinated. The convoy glittered in the distance like a promise. Syrn had not expected that Jax's approach would be half theater, half engineering. He did not expect that the alumni could turn a decoy into a Trojan barnacle. At the appointed moment, Jax did what he did best, he made a ridiculous joke into a plan. He had the alumni perform a retreat which, in their culture, involved throwing down banners and singing a slow, formal elision of shame. Syrn's men, petty and certain they were winning, stepped forward to collect what they considered minor trophies. They did not notice the traps. They did not notice the stations that were rigged to send out a sound frequency that made their calms flare. They did not notice the catering drones, which Quibble had given specific improvised directives and which now rained down netting and warm noodles into their boots. It was messy, humiliating, and successful. Syrn, watching the farce become a trap, chose direct action. He boarded with a small team and confronted Jax as if a private conversation could win what his tactics could not. Syrn's crew were excellent at swagger and mediocre at subtlety. He had a face that looked like he ate poetry for breakfast and left the wrappers behind. "You think you can outwit me with humor?" he asked, as if humor were an insult and he had a handkerchief for it. "No," Jax said, and the phrase cut through the camp like a shovel. "I think I can outjoke you. It's more dangerous because it's underrated." Syrn advanced. He had a blade that glittered and a coat that suggested he had read a lot of strategists. Aelara stepped between them with the measured grace of someone who had practiced politeness to the point of weaponry. "You will not break the treaty," she said. "You will not take me." Syrn laughed. "Regalia and speeches," he said. "I prefer profit." It was then, in the cramped hull of a skiff that creaked like a creature in its sleep, that Jax did something nobody expected. He offered Syrn a wager. It was absurd and idiotic, in the way that Jax's choices often were. He proposed a game that involved relocating a stolen navigation core from one hull to another while both teams attempted to recapture it. It was, by design, ridiculous. The prize was symbolic, Syrn's promise to leave the Arendor cluster if he lost. Syrn threw his head back and laughed at the audacity. He accepted, because pride is often the most expensive currency. The contest unfolded like a comedy with stakes. There were slams and bumps, the sort of slapstick Jax had never trained for and yet performed with genius. The alumni used ritual to confuse. Quibble deployed suggestions like, "Consider wooing your opponent with dramatic gestures," and the robots cheered. Syrn was good, brutal, and infuriatingly competent. He had been forged by violence and charisma. He was also, crucially, predictable in ways Jax was not. The climactic moment came when Jax, forced into a corner of a maintenance bay with two of Syrn's men bearing down, stared at the navigation core and then at Syrn. He grinned the kind of grin that suggested either madness or revelation. With the fluidity of a man who had been fixing strange engines for most of his life, he rerouted a conduit with his plasma wrench. The wrench sang. It sang as a thing of purpose and as a joke. It made a sound that the hull understood, a note that resonated with old metal and old ghosts. The lights pulsed, the sound harmonized with the alumni chorus, and SYRN's men hesitated because the universe loves a dramatic pause. When they lunged, Jax swung the wrench in a wide arc that clipped a support and sent a cascade of maintenance grates falling over the opponents like theatrical curtains. The movement was less about precision than about misdirection. If you made the right noise and looked like you meant it, fate tended to side with you. It had been that way for as long as he'd been alive. Jax's swing was a thing of raw competence married to comedic timing. The result was humiliation and a prisoner with a dented helmet. Victory had a strange aftertaste. The prize was not gold nor rank. SYRN, defeated, slunk away, nursing wounds and a bruised ego. The Arendor cluster breathed in relief. The alumni were overjoyed. Aelara was, for reasons that were not entirely clear to Jax, luminous. She looked at him in a way that removed the protector/subject distinction and left only two people who had been through a shared ridiculousness. "Why do you keep doing it?" she asked him once the bustle subsided and the twin sons were fondly exhausted. The alumni had declared a day of rest that looked mostly like mending and telling stories. Jax sat on a heap of salvaged trim and ate something the alumni assured him was hearty, which had the texture of nostalgia. He thought about it, and then, because honesty was his fallback, said, "Because someone expected me to be a different person. Because humor is cheap and I've learned to make change. And maybe," he added, "because he allowed himself small moments of hubris, because I like to see things work again." Aelara's hand brushed his. The biosuit, obedient to the human touch, made a soft, approving sound. "You have reassembled more than machines," she said. "You have given my people a story. Stories travel. They instruct. They become commands. Be careful with your jests." Jax snorted, fond and half agreeing. "I've already been careful, by accident. I can go the rest of my life fixing engines and drinking bitter broth." "What if your life is the engine," she suggested, "and high wind is what keeps it running?" That thought, as gentle as the sun, settled somewhere between possibility and warning. The alumni, who had followed him with the literal devotion of those bound by old law, were not content merely to go home. They wanted a leader. The galaxy, having heard the echo of his antics, decided he would be a convenient figurehead. He was being offered a place in a legacy slot he had never applied for. Jax faced a choice that in any other life would have been written in a pamphlet: accept the title and step into a space where certainty met ceremony, or decline and remain itinerant, a storyteller of small, effective disasters. He was afraid of both. Leadership required sacrifice, a word that tasted like gray dust in his mouth, but he had learned how to live with sacrifice. It fed him sometimes, like a necessary ration. They marched to Arendor Prime, which was, in person, more impressive than the stories allowed. The twin suns gilded the dunes with a yellow so intense it felt like decision-making aftershave. The city itself had a geometry of old wealth and the kind of bureaucracy that wore its weight like armor. The populace watched with a kind of fascinated confusion as the ragged army paraded down boulevards, the alumni banners and human jokes blending into a single, peculiar pageant. At the ceremony, which was long, undulating, and full of the kind of formalities that required a librarian's patience, Jax stood with Aelara by his side. He wore no ceremonial coat this time, though the council tried to press one on him. He refused with a reasonable policy that involved a clearly argued speech about mobility and cramps. The alumni presented gifts: a braided strand of iridescent fiber, a codex of accidental ceremonies, and a small relic that resembled a snack. They looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and expectation, two things that, together, weighed on the shoulders like a well-meaning albatross. Jax thought of his plasma wrench, its weight familiar, its jokes embedded in the coil of its casing. He thought of the biosuit, of how it hummed when she laughed. He thought of Quibble, looping a ditty about heroes and their unexpected maintenance issues. He thought, strangely, of home, of a dingy workshop with a cracked hollow of a planet that had more water than sense. The true test of his nature was not the ceremony. It was a small dispatch that arrived after the sand had settled and the speeches were fermenting into law. A distress beacon blinked, feeble and honest, from a nearby settlement caught in a plasma storm. It was nothing glamorous. It was a farm community with a damaged shield array and families who did not have the luxury of choosing their heroes. They had no banners and no crests, and yet they had lives, and their lives had been disrupted by a storm that cared nothing for ceremony. Jax looked at the council. They were ready to debate. They had a committee that specialized in debating. Aelara looked at him with something that did not need committee approval. "Go," she said. "You will always have our gratitude, but not all gratitude is earned sitting in a hall." He had expected the decision to be more noble. Instead, it was crisp. He rose in that moment and accepted not a throne but a task. He rode into the storm with Aelara at his side and Quibble hovering like a worried, helpful satellite. The alumni formed a shield behind them because that was what communities did when someone needed to do something foolishly brave. The twin suns blurred into a smear of gold and heat, and the dunes grew teeth. The rescue was not cinematic in the way cinema imagined. It was dirty, technical, and beautifully prosaic. He waded into ruin and he fixed a failing capacitor array with his plasma wrench while the alumni sang a hymn that doubled as a countdown. They lifted a collapsed shelter with banners tied into slings and carried children out of melted metal like harvest offerings. For once, there were no cameras to frame the moment into a narrative. There were only hands and a little boy who looked at Jax like he'd invented weather. He didn't save the galaxy in that moment. He saved a settlement's day. It mattered. It added up into the kind of life that, when aggregated, became something people called legacy. He smiled because the boy asked him to tell a joke as he patched a tether. Jax told a terrible joke about a wrench and a sunburn and received the delighted cackle that made his chest light. The following months were a stretch of small miracles and bureaucratic entanglements. He negotiated trade routes that involved ridiculous tariffs designed to fund a festival called the Day of Strange Saviors. He organized convoys that carried both food and an old set of joke cards that Quibble had compiled. He learned to wear a ceremonial sash when necessary and to discard it when it smelled of bureaucracy. People began to describe him in pamphlets with phrases like unexpectedly inspiring and an odd but earnest hero. He tried to avoid pamphlets. They were sticky and often inaccurate. In the quiet hours, when the twin suns set and the desert cooled enough that you could think without the sensation of being fried alive, Aelara and Jax sat on the rim of a recovered hall and watched the stars whiz into place. Quibble hovered nearby, offering facts like a petulant knowledge lamp. The biosuit hummed warmth onto Aelara's skin. The planet's heat shimmered in waves, and the wreckage field looked like the bones of something ancient being tended by curious children. "Do you ever regret it?" Aelara asked, eyes like two moons in miniature. "Regret?" Jax said. He thought of the lives he'd patched, of the dinners he'd missed, of the friends he'd made, and of the unexpected weight of a protective role. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But not often. It's easier to regret staying when the world is loud. Adventure has a way of making regrets into stories." She tilted her head. "You are reckless in a manner I admire." "Call it improvisational optimism," he said. The phrase was almost a joke. He loved the way the stars looked when they agreed with his metaphors. "I tend to make up plans as I go." She laughed, a sound that had not escaped her since the first day he'd poked that wire and wrung her awake. "You make different plans." She reached out, fingers tracing the worn edge of his plasma wrench. "You are not what I expected when my biosuit registered an external intervention. You are, instead, a disruption that mends things." He met her gaze. "You could ask for a better leader. I won't stop you. But if you insist on following me because of ceremony, at least know this, I will try to make things work. I will try to make you laugh at the worst possible moments. I will, occasionally, be useful." Her smile widened, slow and certain. "You have become an echo I did not anticipate," she said. "It will follow you. It will follow us. That is not a goodbye." She held his hand, which beneath the sand was rough and warm. "That is a map." They walked the sands back toward the camp, the twin suns dimming into a soft, conspiratorial glow. Behind them, in the growing dusk, the army moved like an organism given a new rhythm. The alumni were no longer simply an army. They were a traveling community who told jokes in the dark and lit their fires with salvaged rigging. They had acquired songs about a human who made a living out of bending wires and bending fate. On the last night before they halted their march to settle a longer while, Quibble floated up and in a surprisingly dignified tone announced, "History is now accepting submissions." Jax raised his coffee can in a toast to the orb and to the twin suns. "To mistakes that go well," he said. Aelara replied, squeezing his hand. "And to those who fix them." They had become serious in a way that made sense. They had also become ridiculous, which made more sense still. The galaxy, as it tends to do, recognized the new pattern of things and stamped it with interest and curiosity in equal measure. Old allies sent cautious aid. New friends traded in spices and stories. Aelara's army, whose loyalty had been a legally binding ripple started by an accidental touch, marched with a pride that tasted like reclaimed sand. Jax's life was full of small tasks that collectively made an architecture, the fixing of doors, the reprogramming of combs, the negotiation of tariffs with hungry patrons who took the spectacle of heroism as an entertainment tax. There were, though, more important things. He kept telling jokes in circumstances that required them like a man who watered a garden that had once been dry. People laughed because he taught them how to laugh through the dust. He led in the only way he knew, by being useful, by being honest about his fears, and by being an unapologetic participant in the universe's ridiculousness. Months later, when Aelara stood on a raised dais and addressed a gathering of alumni and allies, she spoke plainly. "We have always respected tradition," she said, "but tradition must be tempered by those who are willing to act in its name. Jax Harrow has done this. He is not a perfect man. He is a man who makes mistakes and remedies them. We will follow where he goes because he shows us that even a joke can be a tool." There was a murmur of approval. The alumni, practical as always, nodded at the logic. Jax flushed. He disliked speeches, partly because they were long and partly because they required one to be comfortable in being praised. He was, it turned out, perfectly comfortable because the applause felt like the sound tools make when they've been polished. The arc of his life curved toward a new kind of legacy, one measured not by statues or by flags but by repaired things and people who could laugh when their shields failed. He built a workshop on the edge of the dunes where the sand was a little less scorched and the twin suns made things golden the way they were supposed to in old postcards. He set up benches and taught apprentices, some human and many alumni, the kind of mechanical sympathy that encouraged broken units to sing again. Quibble became an educational assistant with a microphone and a terrible sense of timing. Aelara sometimes stood at the workbench with him and learned the way humans thinned metal and made art out of necessity. The army did not dissolve because armies don't so much dissolve as they evolve into civic services. The alumni became a hybrid of ceremony and service, a populace that could make a shield and organize a festival in the same afternoon. They traded with their neighbors and protected small communities from the kinds of predations that made the Arendor cluster nervous. It was, for a time, a good life. Inevitably, stories attract attention. There were, beyond their comfortable environs, new dangers that twined around the edges like jealous vines. Corporations with names like Argent Meridian wanted to monetize the phenomenon. Warlords who had missed their chance sought revenge. The galaxy sent letters of interest and requests for symposium appearances. Jax answered to none of them with a shrug so pronounced it became his trademark. On the morning a particularly boorish senator arrived to propose a statue, because the galaxy insists on memorials as though the past were a collectible, Jax walked into the assembly wearing grease on more layers than politically sensible and announced, "If you want a statue, make sure it's hollow. You'll need a place to put the things you don't want to deal with." The senator was scandalized in a way that would later become a generation's gag. The statue was never made. Instead, they opened a new seed fund to support repair workshops across the cluster. Jax's name, oddly, was part of the paperwork, like a signature on a map. There were quieter, sweeter payoffs that no public office could buy. Children in remote settlements learned to craft their own spanners. A temple of the alumni converted its old ritual space into a workshop that smelled of oil and incense. Aelara and Jax took to walking the dunes close to nightfall, sharing stories and arguing whether the best repair job was one that looked professional or one you couldn't see the seam in at all. On the anniversary of the day he poked that wire and found a princess laughing at the idea of his gloves, Aelara presented him with a token, a small circlet woven from the iridescent filament the alumni used for their ceremonial veils. It sat lightly on his head like a ridiculous crown and made him look, absurdly, regal. He accepted it and, being the man he was, immediately used it to open a stubborn panel in a generator because the circlet had come in handy as a makeshift screwdriver in an emergency. The years that followed were a mix of adventure and repair. They sailed through plasma storms and argued with warlords who insisted that a little dominance was an efficient use of time. They negotiated peace treaties that read more like pragmatic shopping lists. They rescued an elderly poet from a canyon and helped a pair of merchants discover a new route that avoided the worst wormholes. They did the kinds of things that do not make the history books but keep people alive. There were nights when Jax woke up with sand taste in his mouth and thought of the old workshop and the people he'd left. He would sometimes ride out alone, a routine pilgrimage to the wreck where he'd first poked the wire. The hulls had been salvaged, the sand had settled, and the twin suns touched the horizon in a way that made the wreck look less like ruins and more like a temple of unlikely salvation. He would set his plasma wrench on the rust and watch it glint. He thought of how small decisions expand like rivulets into rivers. Aelara once asked him, looking at the toolkit he'd gathered over the years, "Do you think you would have been different if you never poked that wire?" He considered the question. He had invented 1,000 different possible lives in his head. He could have been a mechanic in the city, with steady work and fewer scars. He could have been someone who never left the docks. He could have been a man who made no mark at all. Instead he was, by a series of accidents and good-natured brashness, a mover of people and a mender of things. "No," he said honestly. "I'd probably still be fixing things. Maybe I'd have fewer enemies with polished armor." He smiled at her. "But I don't know. Maybe this was the version of me that takes better pictures." She laughed and leaned against him. "Your photographs will be in the wrong light but worthy of stories. That is the essence of being human in a galaxy that appreciates spectacle. You are small, you are noisy, and you find ways to turn that noise into music." Jax had become a figure who made music in a desert of wreckages. The alumni army followed him because of law, but they stayed because of affection. He learned their histories. He taught them how to fix a generator so it would not die in a storm. He taught them to laugh, and he taught them, inadvertently, that accidental heroism was as effective, sometimes more, than planned valor. In the end, the greatest test of his accidental heroism came not from space pirates or senators but from the quiet truth of leadership, choosing what to keep and what to let go. The Arendor cluster was vast and messy. It needed a lot of fixes and a few good arguments. There were wars to guard against and livelihoods to protect. Jax could have taken the mantle in full, the title, the banner, the neat promises and tidy schedules, and done it with humor and competence. He could have become a proper leader with staff and decorum. Instead, he chose a middle path that suited him. He refused to be a monarch and accepted being a steward. He kept the workshop, the apprentices, the traveling parades of the alumni. He went where things were broken and where people told jokes, where a wrench could fix a life and a laugh could steady a heart. He chose to be the kind of hero who did not want statues. He wanted patched doors and warm bowls for those who could not afford copper. Years later, when children in the Arendor cluster asked Aelara about the human who made them laugh in the middle of storms, she told them the truth. "He is not a god," she said. "He is a man who uses what he has to make things right. He is a man who will give you a bad joke and a good repair." And those sentences traveled, as all stories do, altered slightly with each telling, until Jax became both legend and neighbor. He had friends in the council who respected him. He had enemies who kept him humble. He had apprentices who learned to wield a plasma wrench and a comedic timing in equal measure. He had a world that depended on his particular mix of courage and nonsense. On a clear morning when the twin suns slanted across the dunes in a way that made the wreckage glitter like an old jewelry store thrown open on a holiday, Jax stood on the rim of a mound and watched his people assemble. The alumni marched with their polished armor, Quibble hovered with a scarf tied in mockery around its orb, and Aelara stood proudly at a distance, not above him but beside him. They had arranged themselves not as an army now but as a caravan of service. He couldn't help but grin. Maybe, just maybe, this was the adventure he'd always half wished for. After all, sometimes the galaxy's greatest heroes were the ones who could still crack a joke in the middle of a plasma storm.